So this is going to be a video on how to beat the Scandinavian defense. I've basically covered every mainline and sideline here for white, and I'm really happy with this work because I haven't taken any of the lines from any courses. This is all purely based on my experience and work through with the engine. And basically, you can classify this opening as a B tier opening because it does break at least two principles in the opening of moving the same piece twice and also bringing your queen out too early. So yeah, there is an advantage to be proven in the Scandinavian, similar to, if you're facing the Alekhine. And there are some things to know about it, but overall, the threat of the Scandinavian isn't that big, basically, because the worst thing that could happen if you play badly against the Scandinavian is that your opponent gets an equal position. And so there are not like the tricky traps that exist, like for example in the Alekhine defense. So yeah, hopefully, yeah, you can like try to absorb some of the thematic ideas, as I'm not hoping that anyone really tries to memorize every single thing, but at least you can get some of the thematic ideas, and you have a basic overview on how to deal with every single variation here. So yeah, let's talk about the Scandinavian. E4, D5. And so this opening doesn't have a very good reputation, but recently, because of the introduction of the computer, it's proven exceptionally difficult for black to reach a playable position, basically, if white knows what they're doing. And it's only if white knows what they're doing, because a lot of variations are just that just seem okay for white actually gives black like full equality, basically, and they get their pieces out like really quickly, right? So yeah, d5 makes a lot of sense because like you want to kind of like fight against the center, especially this e4 pawn, but normally black does this, if they want to play d5, they will either play it with the French, moving the pawn beside it, or playing it with the Caro-Kann, right? And so the downside of d5 is obviously that after we take, and black has a couple moves here, they can either play queen takes d5, which runs into the move knight c3 with tempo, right? And they also have the move knight f6 here, which was popular for some time, but I think that white has a sizable advantage here. First off, against the sideline, we'll play d4, and there is this so-called Portuguese Gambit with bishop g4. Now, it's not very good, but in the past, this was a very tempting try because Grandmaster David Smurden from Australia actually wrote a book on this move, and he basically argued that after f3, the bishop drops back to f5, so this move f3 is provoked, right? And essentially, if you try to defend the pawn with c4, which is one of the ways you can defend it, black can play e6 here. And after you take, which is already a mistake, black plays knight c6, puts pressure on the center, and is completely happy with this, with the king being out, which seems like it's in the open, but actually white's center is actually under pressure, and this move f3 doesn't really help white's position, right? So that's the idea, and the very tricky and very interesting idea to bring the king out to f7. But I've actually proven that, I mean, not me, but like theory has proven that bishop b5 check, and then here, basically, this move, yeah, just gives white an advantage. We'll talk about the moves after knight bd7. And basically, I just want to give back the pawn and show that the ensuing positions are actually very difficult for black to manage. So that's my idea. After bishop b5, we will not be playing the move c4. Okay, and that's the Portuguese Gambit. Against knight takes d5, objectively, the best move is knight f3. But because there are a lot of complications that can happen after this, I just suggest to play the move c4, which is more forcing, and I think that white still has a nice advantage, but it does like perhaps allow this line with knight f6, and black will play c5 next, and we will enter an endgame which is quite a bit favorable for us, but it's just, it does enter an endgame, so might not be the taste to everyone. In that case, I would suggest you look at knight f3 and try to do some analysis on by yourself. But essentially after c4, there are two moves, knight f6, which is better, or the move knight b6, which is quite a lot worse. And here we'll just play knight f3, and we will enjoy a nice advantage here. At some point, we'll play c5, and it just depends on the position. So that's the move knight f6, right? Against queen takes d5, we'll play knight c3, the most principled move hitting the queen. And black here has a couple moves. They can play the move queen a5 check, which is quite an amateurish move because it does help white to develop with bishop e2. But the reason that I want to cover this is because Grandmaster Alexander Shimanov is actually a specialist in this line following bishop g4, and he's actually has a really good score in this line. He's beaten Corona, for example, in 2022. So yeah, I do want to cover this. Also, there are other moves, instead of bishop g4, but we'll cover that. The move queen d8 is the most passive move, but you know, they lose 2 tempi, but of course white needs to prove an advantage against this. Otherwise, black is just going to simply develop and have a good position. But the downside of this move is after d4, black can't really challenge the center with c5 or e5 effectively. For example, after g6, which makes sense to try to put some pressure on this pawn on d4, but we'll just play knight f3 and we'll enjoy a very nice advantage. And against knight f6, then we will play knight f3 again. And for example, one idea is maybe to play the move bishop g4, just trying to take the knight over here and try to set up the pawns with the light square strategy. This is a very common idea in the Scandinavian, but I will prove to you that all of the variations favor white whenever black plays the move bishop g4, as well as in the lines with bishop f5. Actually, I think both bishops move are actually quite bad. And even though it is the main line with the move bishop f5, we will see that it's actually quite difficult for black to navigate those positions. And essentially after this, we will almost always play h3 and takes. After c6, the problem of white playing the Scandinavian is that if white plays a move like bishop e3, you know, or puts their bishop in an ineffective position, then okay, they can claim a slight advantage, but in a human sense, it doesn't really feel like a lot. So instead, we have to choose the most aggressive setup if we can. And in this position, we'll play the move queen d3. And the idea is that we just simply want to play bishop d2 and long castle, and we want to keep this g-pawn free to advance forward. And so if black, you know, black has the castle king side, right? Because this queen side has been weakened. And after that, we will play g4 and we will go for the attack. And I think that white proves a really, really nice advantage here. And in practice, it's very difficult. That's against queen d8. Against queen d6, this is a favorite of Grandmaster Sergei Tiviakov, who is a Russian Grandmaster who now, I think, plays for the Netherlands, although he has basically like retired at this point, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, he chose this move quite a while back. I mean, he's relied on this move for a long time, and I think that you do need to know quite a lot of things, but white still proves an advantage for d4. Now, the downside of this move with the queen on d6 is that it can actually get vulnerable. You know, it's actually quite vulnerable to the move bishop f4. So we'll see after knight f3 and knight f6, knight f3. Here, there are two main moves, c6 and a6. Bishop g4 is not very good, and we will cover that. But against c6, I recommend the move knight e5. And the idea is after knight bd7, we will play the move knight c4 here. And the queen is being harassed, queen c7, and this move a4 is quite nice, just to gain some space. And basically, it's kind of like hoping that black plays knight b6, so that we play knight e5 to avoid the exchange, and then later we can play the move a5 to get some extra space with the knight already on b6. That's the idea. There's also the move f4, which is a line that Shimanov has used multiple times against Tiviakov, and he's won those games, but it's quite a bit more wild. Like, white has ideas of pushing g4, and it's kind of like this stuff, but it's also playable, and I'll just mention it, just for a short bit. But essentially, knight c4 is my main recommendation. That's against c6. Against a6, the idea behind this move is to play b5 and bishop b7. But black should be careful not to actually put the bishop on b7 too early. So here we'll just play g3, both preparing the move bishop f4 and also bishop g2. So now with the bishop on g2, it's quite effective, because if black wants to fight for the long diagonal, then we will challenge their bishop basically. And the exchange of bishops, we will see, actually favors white. So that's this line with queen d6. Against the main line with queen a5, which is what I expect most people to face, we will play d4. And okay, c6 and knight f6, basically they just transpose. Black has nothing better. But after knight f6, knight f3, black again has the option here to go bishop g4, bishop f5, or even the move c6, which is quite flexible, right? And against bishop c4, bishop g4, we will always play h3, and we're always happy to win the bishop pair here, because we will activate our queen and already hit b7. Against the move bishop f5, we have to go for this move knight e5, and this really outlines the downside of the queen on a5, as well as the downside of the bishop on f5. Because after e6, the queen is running out of squares, and after, let's say, g4, bishop g6, here I believe the move is knight c4. Yep, if I'm not wrong, and yeah, this one should prove white an advantage here. Or even h4, bishop b4, bishop d2, something like this, I think I will cover as well. And the main point is that with knight e5 is that knight bd7 fails to knight c4, and the queen will either go to one of these squares and they will just lose. So After knight e5, c6 is forced, essentially to give the queen some space, and then white will play bishop c4 with tempo hitting f7, e6 is forced, and then now g4. This is the thematic idea. Whenever the bishop is on f5, you have the idea of knight e5 and g4. And we will just follow a couple moves, bishop g6, and now h4. And basically the complications here, as I will go deeper in the actual theory section, favors white by quite a bit. And I will show you how to play it. And even though you may like forget a lot of the theory, it's actually like quite easy to navigate I wouldn't say it's like super easy to navigate the complications, but it's more difficult for black to navigate them than white. So yeah, let's get right into the theory. Okay, so after e4, d5, ed5, knight f6, we'll cover this one first. d4, just very principled. If black plays bishop g4, the Portuguese, and we go f3, bishop f5, we've talked about this position, we'll go bishop b5 check. And if black plays c6, simply they lose this pawn without enough compensation. Something like this would already give white a nice advantage. They can just castle, knight g2, knight e2 is the only move, and then castles and knight g3. And computer says that there's only like a plus 0.5 or a bit more than that, but it's a really easy position to play, and I don't see how black has enough compensation here. So instead, knight bd7 is the main move, and here we will play the move knight c3. I think that this is more effective, and the idea is that black can't really develop, if g6, bishop g7 doesn't really make sense to look at this pawn, and otherwise we're just going to be up a pawn, right? So here black has to break the pin with a6, bishop a4, b5, bishop b3, and now knight b6. So they basically want to win this pawn, right? And try to develop with e6, bishop e7, something like that. But here we'll play knight g2. After black wins back the pawn, we will just simply give back the pawn and prove that black's position is so awkward here. After knight takes d5, knight takes d5, we'll castle and e6. And it seems like black is fine, but after our next move, knight g3, the bishop is being hit, bishop goes back to g6, and now f4. And I think that basically black is much worse here. If they go bishop d6, this is a move that I faced once against a grandmaster, a Vietnamese grandmaster, then simply bishop d5 and f5 just traps the bishop. Easy enough. In case they play the move c5, which is one of the moves that has been tried in practice, then we have this very strong response c4. And the point is that if bc4, it loses to bishop a4 check, and the king is misplaced, and then I will play f5, opening up the entire position, and black is lost. So instead of bc4, they have to play the move knight b6, but now we'll play the move f5. So we have to play very energetically here to prove an advantage. E takes f5, and now queen f3, hitting, potentially threatening the move queen c6 check. And after bishop e7, just black is desperately trying to get castled, and if we play queen c6, they will play the move knight d7, just retreating. So here, we actually can take the pawn on c5 on with dc5 here. And the point is that if the bishop moves again, then we've basically won a tempo. So for example, after bishop takes c5, we can even play the move bishop e3. And taking on e3 would be bad because this would be a check, just misplacing the king, right? And the rooks just occupy the open files, and even if we're down a pawn, it doesn't feel that way, right? And so instead, black will have to play the move queen c7, trying to defend the bishop, but now we have a strong move queen f2, essentially trying to force black to take on e3, and we'll give the check, basically, right? And after queen f2, black can play knight d7, trying to defend the bishop, but now we'll take on b5 here. And this opens up the c file. So if black castles, then rook a c1, and this is very awkward to deal with. We're potentially going to take this pawn next. We have two passed pawns, which, in the endgame are going to be very useful, and this pawn is going to be won sooner or later, so we will be up a pawn. And if they play f4, which is quite forcing, then now we can take on c5. And okay, you cannot take on g6 here because the rooks come in, bishop e7, and then h takes g3, and the rook is coming to c1, and this is game over, right? So they can't take this pawn, take this knight on g3. They'll have to take on c5, which looks like it forces the exchange of queens. But this is a very miserable endgame after rook a to e1, king d8. We play knight e2 here, so we can try to win the pawn on f4 with the knight. Potentially queen takes f2, rook f2, a takes b5, and now knight takes f4. And if we look at this position, the b5 pawn is weak. The king is uncastled and, very vulnerable to the rooks and infiltrating the position. And the bishop is going to be taking, on g6 is going to be taken next, and it's going to double the pawns as well. So white is much, much better, and black is very close to losing this position. So yeah, this endgame, bailout doesn't really work. And after dc5, if they play bishop dc5, we will play bishop e3. And if they go knight d7 here, we will play bishop e3 first, just developing, trying to defend this pawn. After the castle, we'll occupy the center with rook a1. Now queen c8 makes sense to try to pile up pressure on this pawn, but now we'll play c6. After knight e5, we'll play queen d5, hitting the knight. Basically, it forces knight takes c6. Because if they play a move like bishop f6, then after we take the pawn on b5 and go bishop d4, black is under enormous pressure here, and they're basically lost. Instead, if they play a move knight takes c6, just winning back the pawn, then after we take this pawn on b5, ab5, and rook c1, there's a lot of pressure on this knight, which forces rook a6. Then we'll just simply take the pawn, and everything in black's position is loose. This bishop is bad, this pawn is weak. We have two very nice and active bishops. We have also two passed pawns in the endgame, which will win the day. So yeah, that's basically this line with c5 here, trying to imbalance the position. Here, the only move according to the computer is to move f5, and this is really, really bad. Like, imagine that if you have to play the only move f5 in this position, you weaken the e6 pawn this much. So yeah, we'll first off start with playing queen e2, hitting the pawn. Black can play a couple moves here if they, and also the idea of queen e2 is not only to put the pressure on the e6 pawn, but also put pressure on the b5 pawn. Now this is relevant after black plays the move queen d6, and then now we play a4, targeting this pawn. Okay, here taking on e4 is not an option because the rook will get active, so black can maybe play rook b8, but now we play rook e1, hitting the e6 pawn, king f7, and then now a very, very nice maneuver, which just is very creative, and this is a very nice thing that I want to mention, knight h1. And the knight is actually heading to e5, and there's nothing that black can do about it. So white is basically much, much better here. And it's not clear to see, how black will get their king to safety here. So yeah, essentially that is this Portuguese Gambit, and I think that with this, I don't think that a lot of people know this refutation. So this is going to be a very nice weapon in your arsenal. That's the Portuguese. Against the move knight takes d5, this is a bit more complicated. After c4, first off, knight b6 is the most popular move, which is very common in, like, it looks like, the Alekhine defense sort of positions, but this is actually quite bad. So first off, we'll play knight f3, and we're inviting the move bishop g4. So black's idea with bishop g4 is actually so that they can take, and then play the move knight c6 to put pressure on d4. So we don't want to play a move like h3, because this one will give black a lot of counterplay, actually. So instead, we'll play c5 first, and this is the downside of playing the move bishop g4, is that it undefends the b7 pawn, right? So white has ideas to move queen b3. Now black is faced with a difficult decision here, to play the move knight 6 to d7, just retreating, or to play knight d5. Now, according to the database, most people know to play the move knight 6 d7, and this move is only good because, this move is better because of the alternative, because the alternative is just bad after knight d5. And the reason is that, oops, I think I skipped a bit too much there. Knight takes d5, c4, knight b6, knight f3, bishop g4, c5. And the reason that knight d5 is bad is because now, if the bishop ever takes on f3 here, it basically, like, the knight on d5 just obstructs his diagonal. So we will see concretely that it allows the move queen b3. And black cannot play the move knight c6 here because we'll take on b7. And you cannot take the d4 pawn because it's defended. And you cannot take f3 now because the c6 knight falls with check. And so if this knight wasn't on d5 and it was on d7, then black could have taken on f3, and defended the knight on c6, basically. Which is the reason why after knight d5 we play the move queen b3, and against the move knight 6 to d7 we don't play queen b3, because this allows the move knight c6 and takes bishop f3, and later the d4 pawn falls while this knight is defended, right? So this doesn't really work out for white. So instead, after the move knight d5, we'll cover this one, we'll play queen b3. Here, if they play the move bishop takes f3, then we can simply win the game after queen takes b7. And they're gonna have to, this one doesn't work because of simply g takes f3. The rook is falling even though they have knight c2 check. And after knight d7 here, we'll take on f3. And despite having a weakened pawn structure, we will play knight c3 next. And black either has to take on c3. So for example, after e6, knight c3, they'll either have to take on c3, which fixes our structure somewhat. We still have the bishop here. And these pawns actually prevent black from developing really easily. So very nice position. And also white's a pawn out. So instead of bishop takes f3, they have to play the sad move bishop c8. But here now we'll play knight c3, hitting this knight. So we'll be very happy to see this exchange because white has a lead in development and a very strong center here. Instead, e6 is better, but now we'll play bishop c4, threatening the knight. Black can play c6 here, but now we've basically accomplished, what we wanted to do, which is to shut down this bishop on c8. After bishop e7, we'll simply play it calmly. We'll play bishop d3, just improving the bishop's position. Also, yeah, this position, the h7 pawn is also very tender. After castles, we'll play queen c2, targeting h7. That's not the only move, but this is very, very clean. h6, and now we'll take on d5. So a3 is also possible, just trying to, advance with maybe b4 in the future. But I like knight takes d5. And the point is that if you take with the c pawn, then white has just a very nice majority and soon a passed pawn with a4 in the future, right? This bishop is also extremely bad. And if you take with the e pawn, which is better, white still can advance the queenside pawns here with b4 and a4, and even break at some point with b5, or just admit, that, or just claim a positional domination with the center and the two bishops. So that's basically this line with knight d5, which is not as good as the move knight d7, but still after knight d7 here, we cannot play queen b3 as I mentioned, so now we'll play bishop e2. So now we're ready for the move queen b3 because we've parried the threat of bishop takes f3. Here now black should play e6 to kind of control the d5 square, but now we play queen b3, hitting b7, b6 is the only move, and then we will simply knight c3. Castling is possible, but knight c3 is good. And the point is that we're just developing, and they cannot take on c5 here because queen b7 would trap the rook, or at least win a piece. Bishop e7, now we play h3, either winning the bishop pair or forcing bishop h5, and now we'll develop with bishop f4. And I just want to stop the position here and just say that white has a nice, very, very nice advantage here because white will castle, play rook a1, and black really finds difficulty controlling all of the light squares as well as trying to develop here. So yeah, a lot of weaknesses in the position. So that is this move, bishop g4. Instead, it's possible to also play the move g6 to try to target the d4 pawn. But if we make sure that our d4 pawn is well defended, then black will not have any pressure and the bishop will actually just, as we call it, stare at granite, or be staring at like a brick wall here. So after knight c3, bishop g7, here, because they have enough pressure over d4, we want to play h3 to prevent the move bishop g4. And then now after castles, we'll play bishop e3, defending our center, knight c6, and now bishop e2. So this looks very similar to the Alekhine defense, and similarly, white has a big advantage here. So, it's hard to find another move instead of e5 because how else will they develop, right? So e5 makes a lot of sense here, but now we play d5, and the bishop on g7 is poor, but black will try to rely on some kingside counterplay, maybe with a move like f5 in the future, in like King's Indian style. Here, knight a5 doesn't work, even though this is very common, a very common idea, trying to target the c4 pawn, because you'll play knight d2, and b4 is basically unstoppable to trap the knight on a5. Instead, knight e7 makes sense. Here, we could castle, which is perfectly reasonable. If black plays f5, then we can play a move like queen b3, and this gives a nice advantage. But in this position, I want to recommend an interesting move g4, which has been tried in practice as well. Just getting more control over the king side and not needing to castle because the center is kind of closed, and white can basically keep the king here and just try to look for the attack. After f5 here, which is very common, very common idea, queen d2. We're perfectly happy to give up a pawn because we want to go for the attack. So here black can try to play e4, and I will suggest a novelty, which of course the computer approves of, the move knight h4. And here after this move, white is basically playing on dark squares. The pawns cannot advance right now because the queen and bishop battery are very nice. And now we can have ideas of long castling as well as bishop h6 just to go for the attack. And if the knight on h4 turns out to be quite poor, we can actually just reroute it to g2 and f4. And I think that white has an advantage here, but work still needs to be done to prove this advantage. And the last sideline in this two Nf6 Scandinavian is after d4, knight takes d5, c4, knight f6. Now, this is the reason that initially I didn't want to recommend the move c4, because black can actually challenge the center with c5 quickly. So that's what we will actually have to allow. So after knight f3, black plays c5. This is the only challenging move. If black doesn't do this, then they're simply worse because white has a big center and black has lost 2 tempi, you know. So here c5. And the thing is that here you cannot or you should not play the move d5. The reason is that after black plays the move e6, they're ready to play bishop d6 and castles next. While typically in the Benoni, in this move e6, we can try to consider ideas of taking on e6 here, but this will just help black to develop with the bishop, right? So pushing d5 is actually an accuracy, and here we have to enter the endgame with knight c3. So what I mean is that black can take on d4 and force us to enter an endgame. Let's cover the sidelines first. Bishop g4 is not that good because after d5, if black plays e6 now, we can play h3 and just basically win the bishop here. Yeah, and like the bishop also just like moves basically out of this one and not in one go if, like, for example, if they did play e6 and then we were to take, right? So after we play h3, we'll just win the bishop pair with a nice advantage. E6 is possible just to delay, you know, taking on d4. So let's look at that. But now what is the hidden development? Let's say bishop e3. Here, okay, knight bd7 is possible. You know, what happens if they just don't take on d4? It makes sense to play d5 in this sort of position, since bishop d6 is not possible, because we can take on e6. This is one way to play. But it does allow some complications after ed5 and bishop f4. There was this game played between 2200s, and it ended in a draw, but white had very good chances for an advantage there. Instead, I will recommend the simple move bishop e2. Very calm. And I just want to get castle in this sort of position. Also notably, knight g4 will be met with bishop g5, so that's not really a problem. Bishop e7, castles. For example, here knight g4 doesn't really help black because bishop f4. And so there are ideas of d5 as well as knight b5, right? And the bishop is actually quite nice on f4, while we can even think about kicking the knight away with h3. So the knight on g4 isn't useful. Instead, if black castles, now we can even have the opportunity to take on c5. So if bishop c5, this is worse because after takes, and b4, white gets a space advantage. And important to understand here is that we have the 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side. So in endgames, this will be very nice for us, at least, so that we can create a passed pawn, right? Better is knight takes c5. And so here we will avoid the exchange of queens with queen c2. And white has a pleasant position because white will soon control the d file with the rook 81. They can play bishop f4 to exert some pressure on the diagonal, and again, this 3 versus 2 majority on the queen side ensures a good endgame. So that's the idea. Yeah, and instead of knight bd7 here, what happens if they take now? Is that luckily we have the option to take on d4 with the knight here, and playing e5 would already be a mistake at the very least because of knight b5, and this pawn on e5, you know, it can become a target in the future perhaps. And yeah, exchanging queens will not be desirable here for black. So a6 here, you know, tries to control the b5 square, but now we can play bishop e2, and again, the more active bishops compared to their counterparts and 3v2 on the queen side just gives white a very easy and pleasant advantage. It's not much, but it's actually quite nice. Like, computer evaluates this as like plus 0.6, something like that. And here, what happens if they take on d4 now? First off, we should not take with the knight because black can play e5 and exchange the queens off. This is okay. Instead, we'll take on with the queen, and after takes, sooner or later, black has to play the move a6, right? I mean, they can do it now, they can do it later, but a6 makes sense now. And here, we could play the move like bishop e3, you know, but it runs into e5, and this is a bit of an issue. Black fights for control over the center. Instead, there's this very nice move knight e4, which intends to actually infiltrate on b6. And yeah, this just takes advantage of the weakened dark square. So black plays knight bd7, we play bishop e3, and then black can consider playing a move like knight g4. But after bishop d2, we'll play bishop e2 next, and we'll hit this knight with tempo. And it's not really useful for black to play the move knight g4, right? Because we will play bishop e2, develop a tempo, and we can even advance to b4 in the future. Instead, black should play maybe a move like e5, controlling the center, but we'll play knight c2, which gives white a nice advantage as well because it prevents bishop b4 check and prepares to advance the queenside pawns. White can also play f3 to control this square and this square, like the e4 and g4 squares. So this is still a very pleasant advantage for white. So yeah, basically this line is covered where you can see that this has a possibility of transitioning into an endgame, but the position is slightly worse, if not quite a bit worse for black. So this is something that we should actually, you know, not prevent. We should actually welcome this with open arms. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. So now let's look at the more serious stuff. Queen takes d5, knight c3, and now queen e5 check. The worst of the 4 options. Here, this is very common in the beginner level because it looks like it's a check, and you know, otherwise the black queen would have to move somewhere else. But really, this just helps white to develop. So we'll play bishop e2. So now we're ready with knight f3 as well as d4 next. If black plays bishop g4, which, as I mentioned, is a specialty of Shimanov, as a surprise weapon, white will play d4, bishop takes e2, knight g takes e2, and so we see that the knight is kind of lured away from the ideal f3 square. But after queen a5, in this position, if white doesn't find the right way to like kind of put pressure on black, then black will have a very fine position because they've gotten rid of their light squared bishop and they've provoked the knight to go to e2, right? So here, we'll have to play the move b4. We can either play it now or after castling, but I like playing the move b4 now. And this is the most challenging move. After queen h5, so they cannot take on b4 here because of rook b1, and the b7 pawn falls. And this is more important because the rook gets active, right? So instead, queen h5 is the choice of Shimanov in these games. And now we will play the move queen d3. So we don't want to castle too early. We just want to kind of put black under pressure. Here we have ideas of the move knight f4. And so knight f4 next will harass the queen without allowing the queen exchange, right? And so here black should play the move e6. Now we could castle, but I like the move knight f4. And black cannot play any other move than queen f5. Because if they play a move like queen g5, then after queen e4, targeting b7, black can take on b4 here. But now we play castle short. And now both b7 and also knight takes e6 are threatened because this is an x-ray, right? So for example, bishop takes e3, knight e6, queen e7, and then now queen takes b7. And after a8 falls, the knight will also be loose. So white ends up on top in these complications. Instead, black has to play the move queen f5. And unfortunately, like I would like to avoid the exchange of queens and just, you know, harass the queen further, but we do have to go for this exchange. But luckily, white is much, much better in this endgame after knight f to d5, targeting c7. And this forces the king to go to either d7 or d8. Let's just look at d8 for instructive purposes. Here, we could play a move like b5, for example. And after, let's say, knight d7, king e2, we have a very simple and very clean advantage in the endgame because any c6 pushes will just leave black with some weaknesses, and we will simply centralize the king, play a4. We have more space in the center, more space on the queen side. The king is centralized in the center of the board, and these are double pawns. So white is much better here. In addition to b5 here, bishop g5 is also a very good move, trying to provoke f6, but now we'll go bishop f4. And basically c6, knight c7, bishop b4, king d2. The complications here favor white. For example, knight e7, rook h to b1, occupying the b file, bishop takes c3, king takes c3, and you cannot play the move knight d5 here, because this will result in a very poor endgame, because look at this position with the active rook. Which is why black has to give up the exchange, and after b6, we don't even need to take the rook immediately. We can play a4. And if black plays a move like knight d5, we can take and play a5. And this is too much pressure for black to deal with, essentially. And after, if they play a move like knight g6, trying to target the bishop, we will play bishop g3, which allows them to go f4. But now we'll take on a8, f takes g3, h takes g3. And it turns out that it's, even though we can, the knight will be lost, we will get 2 pawns for it, and this a pawn will be really free to go up the board. Let's say king c8. I'll just show a sample line here, a7, and even in this position, I think a5 is good. Computer recommends king b3, or a5 loses to knight d5, so either king d3 or rook b3 here, just retreating, and it's a very, very nice position. I think this makes a lot of sense to go for c4 next. So that's the idea, right? And yeah, this basically covers this this line that Shimanov specializes in e6, knight f4. Yeah, and basically we entered this endgame, and that's what you need to know, that the endgame is just very good for white. But it's not too much to know in this, in the specialized line by Shimanov, but you do need to know this move b4. Against the move c6, which is more solid, which gives the queen square on c7 to retreat to, we'll just play knight f3 followed by d4, and this just looks like a normal Scandinavian, but the queen moved, multiple times for no reason, even giving us a free move to develop to. If they go bishop f5, simply they've neglected development for too long, and after castle and let's say e6, trying to control the d5 square, we can still break in the center with d5 because we have this idea of going knight d4. For example, ed5, knight d4, bishop g6, and now rook e1. So this shouldn't surprise anyone because black has neglected their development for such a long time that you should be always aware of these opportunities. Let's say bishop e7, and now we have the move h4. This is the only move to prove the advantage here, which of course it's not out of this world. It just threatens h5, and the bishop is notably quite poor in this sort of position. h5, and now we challenge the bishop with bishop d3, trying to take on g6. So bishop d3, queen d3, king f8, trying to run the king away. And if they can play g6 next, they're going to be okay. So here we should play knight f5 before they get the chance to. And potentially we want to take the bishop if they play a move like g6. But knight d7 makes sense. And now we will play the move queen d4. This is just a sample line to show what can happen. After knight df6, we can even play bishop g5. And there is tremendous pressure here. For example, there is already the potential threat of maybe knight e7, bishop f6, as well as some ideas of rook takes e7 in the air. So this is very good for white. And bishop f5 just never works in a lot of variations here, especially if white is up this much in development. If they play knight f6 here, we can play the move knight e5. This is a very typical move. And it's just designed basically to counter the bishop ever coming to f5. If you play knight bd7, besides the move f4, I think bishop f4 also looks just very, very clean and gives white an advantage after, let's say, here. And if they play bishop f5, then again, we first off can target the queen, bishop f4, queen b6, castles. And now we don't care about the b2 pawn. Oftentimes we just don't care because this is too greedy and they can't do this in the Scandinavian. Queen d2, queen c2, queen e3, and black is actually just lost here because white can play rook a b1 or rook a c1. And with rook a b1, they can also threaten, to trap the queen in. But with rook a b1, but with rook a c1, then it also hits, just hits the queen with tempo. So it's all very good for white. So instead, they cannot take the b2 pawn. They should play a move like e6. But now, the typical idea, remember, against the bishop on f5 and with the knight on e5, is that we play g4, and then even here we can play g5 takes. ed5, not very good because of rook e1. Bishop e7, let's say bishop g4. And it's really difficult for black to develop because now they cannot play castles because we will win a piece with knight takes g6 and the bishop on e7 falls, right? And bishop g4 just prevents the move knight d7. So black has to play a move like queen d8 here just to try to hold on and defend the bishop. But now we'll play queen e2, and again, h4, h5 is coming. Black is simply lost. After c takes d5, I think that, the position just looks very good here. Not sure what you should play, actually. I can try to guess, but I'm guessing c3 is not the good move. I'm guessing c4 in this sort of position looks very good, and I think white should have a very nice advantage, which is correct. Okay, yeah, c4 needs to be the move to try to open up the position. So, yeah, that's good to know. Not very difficult to see, but yeah, this move queen e5 basically just doesn't work because it wastes too much time. The move queen d8 is more solid, and Carlsen has actually won a game against Caruana in 2014 with this move. And they're arguing that they're basically down 2 tempi in an otherwise normal position, right? But the downside that a lot of people don't realize is that this pawn on d4 is just really annoying because black cannot challenge the center. If they go for a setup with g6, trying to put the bishop on g7, then we'll just play bishop knight f3, and basically this bishop, if we defend the d4 pawn well enough, it will simply not be putting enough pressure. If they play bishop g4, remember, the combination of g6 and bishop g4 doesn't work that well because they will basically have a lot of weaknesses in the position as well as giving up the bishop pair. So here we'll play the move bishop c4, now threatening bishop takes f7, right? So they'll have to play e6, and look at this. It's never good to play this sort of, e6 and g6 at the same time because it weakens all of the dark squares, right? And so here we can play h3, kicking the bishop. It forces black to give away the bishop pair. And now, let's say they play a move like knight c6 here, we can already break in the center with d5. Very logical. If they play knight e5, bishop b5 check, c6, and then we can play queen e4. And we will at the very least win a pawn. If they go knight d4 here, then we can play again queen e4. Let's say bishop g7 trying to defend this knight. Now bishop e3 hitting the knight. f5 trying to kick away the queen. Very desperate, but probably necessary. Queen d3, still defending the c2 pawn. And now if they play a move like e5, then this is not very good, because after long castles, after bishop takes d4, the rook is coming into the game with check, right? So they have to play a move like c5 instead, after which we will again long castle. And black's position is just very poor with this, you know, e6 pawn and the king position, just very, very bad. So that is this move, knight c6, right? It also makes sense, you know, some sense to try to put the pawns all on light squares, but this cannot be the right setup, you know. After castles, black again cannot be that greedy, because we will play the move knight b5 here. And if you play queen d8, rook d1, knight d7, and now bishop f4. And the pins and everywhere, if you decide to take the knight, is just too much here. Obviously, we're threatening knight c7 as well as knight d6 maybe. So takes, knight f6, and now bishop e5. And white simply wins, because this is a pin, this is a pin. You know, we'll take the knight on f6 next, and then take the knight on d7 with a winning position. So they can't take the pawn. They can try to play a move like knight f6 here, trying to castle. But here, they're not in time to castle, because we will play rook e1. And now we have the threat of d5, actually, even though it's controlled by 4 pieces right now. Bishop g7, and now d5. And it's necessary to take, otherwise we'll take on e6, right? So cd5, and now we'll play knight takes d5. And if they castle, we will play knight takes f6, and basically the b7 pawn just falls. And this is just a winning advantage. I mean, we have the bishop here. This is a very bad pawn setup, because it's all in light squares. And we're also up a pawn. And if I haven't mentioned, we have the bishop pair as well. Yeah, okay. So basically, the combination of g6 and bishop g4 doesn't work that well, right? Because they will accept concessions positionally, I mean like structurally, as well as giving up the bishop pair. If they go bishop g7 now, then we'll go bishop f4, intending a very aggressive setup with queen d2 and long castles, knight f6. And now it is possible to play a setup like bishop e2, you know, go for something like this, and just centralizing the rooks. But, you know, you do need to prove a bit more things to like prove an advantage. Yeah, it's not as simple. So I prefer the move queen d2 here, just preparing long castles actually. And after castles, black has a couple of options. They can play bishop g4, which tries to take on f3. And if we take with the g-pawn, then basically the pawn structure isn't very good for white to try to attack, right? So that's why, I mean, like, for example, if this sort of position happens, let's just say for instructive purposes, like, I don't understand how, I mean, white can try to push h4, h5, but they've wasted a lot of time with this move h3, right? So here we will defend the knight with bishop e2, and then next we will play h3. And at the very least, we can win the bishop pair. And at the you know, at the worst for black is that we can start to advance the pawns up the board and try to go for the attack. If they go for c6 here, which makes sense to, you know, just to put the pawn on the light square, control the d5 square, we will now play h4. And even at the cost of a pawn with h5, we will gladly sacrifice it, because we'll go bishop h6 next and just, you know, destroy the black king. So bishop g4 here makes sense to try to prevent h5. Bishop e2, again, dealing with the threat, knight bd7, and now knight e5. And this is the problem, is that the position can easily transform to, for example, transform to a very favorable one with a lot of attacking chances. If they take on e5 here, this is already a tactical mistake because of d5. We're hitting this, queen d2, now bishop d2. So getting the bishop out of any danger, possibly. If they play bishop takes e2, then after ef6, we'll simply win some material here, rook d1. And white has 2 minor pieces for a rook and a pawn, but still a big advantage here because of the material and also the quality of the pieces. Best according to the computer is knight e4, but now we'll take on g4, knight takes f2, and this is their argument, is that at least they're, you know, making a triple fork here and also winning the e5 pawn. So bishop f3, takes, bishop e5, and now rook e1, bishop comes back to f6, and now h5. And I think that white still maintains a big advantage because they can go knight e4, maybe blunt the bishop with c3. And yeah, the quality of pieces is just like so much superior for white. So yeah, they can't play knight takes e5 here because of that. If they play bishop takes e2, then we will take back with the queen. And we have ideas here of just going with the pawn storm, right? Knight e5 doesn't really look good because of d5. I'll just show you a sample line here. h5, 6 king b1. Bishop c1 here, rook c4, f4, rook e4, queen d3, and yeah, this position just looks really bad for black. I'll just put a couple more moves on the board. Queen b6, takes, queen h3, h6, queen g4, g5, queen h5, and this is just like too much. We can eventually transition into this endgame where after c3, trying to blunt the bishop, we have ideas of maybe rook h3 to e3, just trying to trade off the rooks. And also maybe rook g1 and g4, g5. That's an idea as well. Yeah, just trying to consolidate the extra pawn up. So yeah, that's the example of this move, knight takes e5. But I don't think anyone is crazy enough to take on e5 because this looks just like a very bad position, even if you look at it like this. Instead, queen c8 is a very passive move recommended by the computer, but f3, g4, and h5 is just really difficult to stop, and white is just going to crash through sooner or later. So yeah, that basically covers this line with queen d8, I believe, because we've covered g6 and knight f6. Actually, no, we haven't covered this line with knight f6, right? So here, black just wants to, you know, try to develop and get castled, so knight f3 makes sense. Here, bishop f5, again, is one of the possible options. Try to get the bishop out of the pawn chain before they play e6. Because if they play e6, like, we're just accepting, like, this is a very good position. Like, there's nothing to be said about this position other than white is just better, right? This bishop is just so bad. So after bishop f5, we'll go with knight e5, and this is a very thematic idea. And if they go e6, again, we go g4, bishop g6, and now an important move is bishop g2, first provoking c6. And after c6, we'll play h4, and black has nothing, black can't do anything against this, against the threats of both h5, as well as potentially g5. So for example, if they play h5 now, we'll play g5 now. Knight d5, and we'll take, and castles is good, queen d3 is also good. Attacking this pawn on f7, and then I will just castle, and this position is simply worse, like much worse for black. Instead of h5, bishop b4 makes more sense. So the idea is that if we go h5, they can go bishop e4 to try to trade off the bishops. And, you know, this is a pin, so we can't take it twice. And now we'll just castle. And now h5 is still a serious threat, right? So they're going to have to take on c3, basically. And after bc3, h5 is basically unstoppable. They can go knight e4 here, but after the move h5, queen h4, this was actually seen in, I think this move knight e4 was seen in practice once, but after h5, queen h4, we can play the move queen f3. So we don't want to take on g6 too early because that will open up the rook, and, you know, black has some pressure on the f2 pawn as well. So now we'll play queen f3, and simply with this f2 pawn defended, this g6 bishop is trapped. We have a winning advantage here. Instead of knight e4, they can play h5 themselves, but again, g5 and knight g6. Here c4 is also good, just kicking away the knight. And then bishop a3 even, and this pawn on e6 is also a permanent weakness, so we can even pile up pressure here, and there's nothing that that black can do against this. So yeah, basically I just want to point out, like, you know, this bishop f5 move looks like the move that a lot of Scandinavian players want to play, but knight e5 is a very strong response. If they play bishop e6, which is better and something that black is not happy to play, but something that the computer recommends, yeah, it's the thing about this position is that, as I mentioned, a lot of positions look like it's just better for white, but if you don't find a concrete way to, you know, because if you don't find a concrete way to prove the advantage, then black can easily get a fine game. And here it's like every single move comes with a downside. Bishop f4 might run into some knight d5 trying to force some exchanges. Bishop e2 doesn't look the most active. Bishop d3 you know, in some variations loses the d4 pawn, though not immediately. Bishop e3 doesn't look that good. Queen d3 is possible, perhaps very reasonable, but actually we can even continue with this move h4, and this is just a very useful waiting move. Basically, it gains some extra space, it prepares the move h5, and it doesn't weaken the position at all because we have sufficient control over the g4 square, so none of the black pieces can occupy it, right? And it's also very effective against this g6 setup because we'll now play h5. And this exchange sacrifice is actually very good for us. They cannot take on d4 here because after bishop e3, queen b4, let's say along castles, this, you know, we're just much better in terms of development. And even though they are up like a pawn and a rook, we'll see after, like, for example, bishop g7, a3 kicking the queen away, queen a5, I mean, like, there's no other square for the queen, right? Queen a5, and now we have the move rook d8 here, which is very nice. And there's a discovered attack on the queen. So we'll get sort of like this position, and white is actually winning, even though black has 2 rooks for the queen, because white's pieces coordinate really well with like knight b5, maybe bishop f4, and yeah, the black rooks are just so inactive. So they can't be that greedy again in the Scandinavian, so bishop g7 makes more sense. But now d5, opening up the position. Like, if they play bishop d5, the main idea is that we really just want this, want to open up the position and lure this bishop to the d5 square. So now we'll play bishop h6. The main point is, like, okay, we're attacking the bishop, but more importantly, we want to play the move rook d1. So if they play the move bishop h6 here, we will play the move rook d1. And they're going to lose a lot of material, some material here back. Queen d6, knight takes d5 here, threatening the pawn on f7, castles, and now knight e3, giving a discovered attack to the queen to b6, and now bishop d3. And because there's pressure on h7, the knight will either come to f5 or g4, and this bishop will be lost. So white will win this position. So instead of bishop takes h6, other moves is possible, like castles fails to queen g5, with mate coming. Rook g8 is, according to the computer, the best move, but this loses a piece actually by force. After castles, bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, c6, knight e4, threatening knight f6 check. So rook g6 is the only move, but now we'll give a check, pick up the h7 pawn, and we have the threat of a c4 next. The computer already recommends something like queen g8, but c4 just wins a piece, right? So instead, b5 is more human, but we'll drop the bishop back to f4. We're now attacking f7 because this is a pin. So king c8 makes some sense, but now we'll play queen h3 check, knight d7, and now bishop takes b5 because there is a mating threat on a6 here with the very nice bishop on f4. So a6 is best, but now we'll play even a very nice move, queen a3. And okay, after king b7, let's say we'll drop the bishop back to d3. The black king is just never going to find safety. Even though technically black is up material, it surely doesn't feel that way. And as long as the white bishops are on the board, black will continue to face problems in this sort of position. So yeah, that's basically this move, d5. Bishop takes d5. If they go knight d7 here, trying to challenge the knight on e5, which is better, but we can take on e6 now, knight takes e5, and f4. And of course, we want to take on f7, so knight g6. We can take on f7, and of course, king f7 fails at f5, and the king is way too exposed. We win 2 pieces for the rook, and we're much better. In case of king f8 here, we will now... Okay, first off, we can't play the move f5. Oops, sorry. Going back. Misclick. d5, knight e5, f4, knight g6, ef7, king f8. We can't play the move f5 to win back the piece. Let's say knight e5, knight e4, knight takes f7, and then bishop c4. I think this one is simply winning because after queen e8, we can play knight c5. Then knight d8 is the only move, but then now we go queen h3, and we have the idea of like either bishop e3 just developing, or bishop h6 to try to remove a defender of the king, and then just infiltrate with the queen even further. So this is very much winning. It's also possible to just develop with bishop e3 and play rook d1 next, something like this. 7 knight b5, and then b3 followed by bishop c4. But I think f5 is more straightforward, honestly. So yeah, I do recommend this one. But again, of course, I don't want you to memorize all of this. I just want you to have the idea that, maybe you'll remember this, maybe you won't, but you have a good idea about what can happen in the position. And that's against g6, right? Against c6 here, which is more solid and less committal, we will again play h5. Now, just getting more space, knight bd7, and now queen e2. And I think that we'll just stop here and just say that white has a very nice advantage because they can play on both sides of the board. g3, bishop g2, or a4, e5, or bishop f4. All of these moves look like really, really healthy, right? And white has a nice position. So yeah, this h4, h5 idea is a very interesting and modern kind of idea. Against bishop g4, this is the move that Carlsen played against Caruana, and the idea is that they want to put the pawns on light squares after they give up the bishop for the knight. And so here we'll play h3, typical move, takes, c6 here, not allowing b7 to be taken. And now I like the move queen d3 here. Again, we will play bishop d2 and long castles, and then go for the attack. I'll give a few sample lines here. e6. In this position, it doesn't really make sense to go for a move like g3, even though Carlsen did play this in the 2014 Olympiad, eventually he got in like an equal position. For example, something like this, h3, like 83, rook e8, and then this sort of position, and then black played e5 and they were equal. Which is kind of the danger of the Scandinavian, is that they are threatening to get into an equal position, and actually they're managing to get some nice counterplay, on the D and E files, but yeah, they soon faltered. Anyways, that's not my recommendation. This is quite passive. Instead, bishop d2, and in this position, knight bd7 makes the most sense. Maybe bishop d6 is possible, but knight a6 has been played once, so I just want to mention it. First, we'll play a3, preventing knight b4, knight c7, and okay, they can play this sort of creative way, but again, we'll play just in our normal, typical fashion, g4, knight c to d5, maybe. They want to exchange some pieces, so we avoid it. And if they play a move like h6 here, preventing the g5 advance, we'll just play bishop d2 and at some point kick away the knight, and we still have ideas of going for the attack, right? If they go b5 here, preventing c4, we'll play g5, now kicking the knight away, and now h4. And this knight is really poor on d7 here. Bishop d6, now bishop g2. And I think that white has a nice advantage. We can wait for black to castle short, and then even go for the attack very quickly. Something like that. Or even h5, h6, I think is very strong. Instead of knight e6, knight bd7 is a bit more standard. And now we'll long castle. Bishop b4 has been played once. We'll play king b1, castles, and now g4. And I think we can stop here and just say that white has a very, very nice attack. So that's the big idea, is that in case black ever goes for this light squared setup, giving up the bishop and then putting all the pawns on light squares, it makes a lot of sense to try to go for the attack, because otherwise black's position is extremely solid. So yeah, that's basically covering this line of queen d8. Next, we're going to look at the two most serious moves, the move queen d6 and the move queen a5. So queen d6, this is, as I mentioned, a favorite of Sergei Tiviakov back in the day, and this is a very rare line practice, but Carlsen did try to revive it in 2019, so a lot of people started to try this more often. And in this case, we'll play d4, again, typical, knight f6, knight f3. And here black again has a couple of options. Now the move bishop g4 doesn't really work well with the move queen d6, because you can see that the downside of the queen on d6 is that it's first off maybe vulnerable to, at some point like knight e5, knight c4, as well as the move bishop f4, right? And so if you play bishop g4, white can play h3, and now the bishop, if they give itself up, then bishop f4 is coming really quickly. For example, c6, and now we should be normal in the queen d8 Scandinavian, fails the bishop f4. You cannot be this greedy, because knight b5, again, typical tactic that wins. Queen takes b2, knight c7, king d8, rook d1, and the white wins. And if you play queen d8 just coming back, then this looks, just like a very bad, like the queen d8, but Scandi, but it's just with the queen moving twice. And now this fails actually to d5 immediately, and black has already lost, surprisingly, because castling is coming. Yeah, and after, let's say, cd5, castle to e6, we can take the knight on b8, and then play bishop b5 check, misplacing the king or forcing knight d7, after which black is just going to get destroyed. Takes, among other things, just wins. Yeah, and the king e7 here, now we'll play rook h1, and black is not surviving this. a6, bishop c4 is just very bad for black, and they might have to play a move like king d6, which is horrible. Yeah, and so, yeah, basically c6 just doesn't work, and they can't play this in a normal way that they would play the queen d8 Scandinavian. And so if they play knight c6 here, which would be somewhat playable, but because, this one is a very challenging line because white needs to know a lot, but if they know a lot, then they're going to be able to prove the advantage here. Bishop f4, this is important. If black plays a move like queen e6, then we'll come back with bishop e3, and we're ready to long castle next. And you cannot take on d4 because b7 is dropping, so yeah, we are ready to castle here. If they long castle, then we play also long castles. Knight b4 here makes some sense to attack a2, as well as try to maybe blockade the center with d5, with the move knight bd5. But now we'll play d5 ourselves, and if they take with knight f takes d5, we'll play a3 here, kicking away the knight. Knight takes c3 is forced, basically if they don't want to lose a piece, dropping this knight back, we just lose the knight over here. So knight takes c3, now we'll misplace the king with rook takes c8, and take the pawn on b4, knight e4, and then we'll play bishop d3, attacking the knight. And after f5, just trying to solidify the knight here, moving back would just make no sense. We'll play rook d1 now, and with the ideas for, like, you know, just securing the king with king b1 as well as bishop d4. Black really struggles with development here. Black will have to play something like this, and bishop d4 is coming, and with the bishop pair, weakened position of the pawn structure, this position really can't be good for black. So yeah, this is not very good, but you know, it is somewhat playable. Black is not dead loss after this. Knight takes d4 is more forcing, but it's and more challenging, but white is better after queen takes b7 here. Knight takes e2, king e2, knight d4, and now king d1. You can't, you know, give a discover check because the queen is hanging, so queen takes f4. Now we take the rook, now we take on a7, and if black takes on f2 here, they fail. It fails because this is an x-ray, right? And we can play bishop b5 check. Knight b5 just loses to, you know, taking the queen. And if king d6, then now we can play rook f1, and queen c2 check is forced. If you take here, then you'll simply lose a knight, and that's going to be made very soon. If you play queen c2 check, which is forced, then after king e1, this knight is still hanging, so you're going to have to play e5. But now white plays rook f2 to kick the queen away. And then after that, we'll play rook d1 with a major and decisive advantage. Knight d5, one sample line is queen e6 check, knight b6, and now queen b7. And there's no way to stop the move queen c6 check because the king is so exposed. If they move the king away, then c7 also drops. So this is just winning. All the way back, so it means that they can't take the pawn on f2, right? So they have to play e6 here, just freeing up their position a bit. But now we'll play queen a4 check. King goes back to d8, one of the possible moves, and now we play rook c1. And only now is it possible for black to take on f2. But now we will try to exchange the pieces with the move knight e2. Black, of course, doesn't want to exchange with, so they play knight f5. But now we insist on the exchange with queen a8 first. King d7, maybe giving another check on c6. Taking the pawn on c7. And then now we can drop the queen back to f4. And white is an exchange up and eventually should consolidate the position with a win. So overall, this move, knight takes d4, is quite challenging because there are like a lot of forcing lines. You know, the king is a bit exposed, but white is better at the end of it. So that shouldn't be something you're afraid of. If they come back with bishop f5, then the bishop is just always bad here. So, you know, we've basically gotten a free tempo with h3, and we can immediately play knight e5 and the g4 here. You know, typical fashion, this is good for white. If they play bishop h5, this is also just really provocative, and we can immediately go for something like this. Knight b7, f4, e6, and now h4. And white is just close to winning here and already has a big space advantage. The computer says something around like +1, but I think that it just feels like a lot more, you know. This is very difficult to deal with. And yeah, so if bishop g4 doesn't work, then let's look at the other move, c6. Now, in this sort of position, it doesn't make sense to go for g3 because even if we put the bishop on the long diagonal, it's just blunted by the c6 pawn, right? So here it makes sense to go with the move knight e5. And this is possible because first off, bishop f5 again runs into some g4 ideas. You can, you know, it's just very good. h4 is just very good for white. If you go now with knight b7, white has a good, you know, a couple of good options here. They can go for f4, which I call the Shimanov line because Shimanov played this a couple of times against the expert Tiviakov, and he won. It's very challenging, but it does require a lot of precision. For example, I'll just show you the line. Knight b6, trying to occupy the d5 square, g4, and then here, in the first game that Shimanov played against Tiviakov, Tiviakov played bishop e6. And then after bishop g2, g6, castles, bishop g7, this bishop turns out to be really vulnerable to f5. And for takes, black played bishop c4, knight c4, knight c4. And now in this position, he blundered basically with the move queen d3, which allowed the move knight g4 and a lot of counterplay here. Instead, better would have been the move king h1, just escaping from any of those threats. Queen e2 is coming next, and white just has a big advantage here because of the open position and the uncastled king. So that's one of the possible lines. I mean, in the next game, he played the move knight bd5, but also position was unclear at some point, but white managed to win as well. So that's possible, but I like also the move knight c4, which is, I think, simpler because it hits the queen at tempo and it makes a lot of sense. After queen c7, again, g3 doesn't make sense here because it's just long term, even though we prepare bishop f4, the bishop just doesn't belong on g2 there. So a4 here makes a lot of sense. Now, the idea is that if black plays a5, this is very weakening because it weakens first off this b6 square. And so if the knight ever goes to b6, it will actually only be defended by the queen, right? And not also the pawn. So, for example, we can play queen f3, preparing bishop f4. Black plays knight b6, bishop f4, queen goes back to d8, and now a very nice move, bishop e5. And this was played once by Carlsen in 2019, I think in the World Blitz Championship. And here, the position is very unpleasant actually, because let's say you play e6. Then white can just continue with h4, h5, and just has a very big advantage. It's very awkward for black to move, basically. If you play a move like g6 here, this already fails actually because of the move knight d6 check. And either you lose the f7 pawn with the fork, or you lose the rook after this fork, right? And so you can't play that. If you play knight bd5, which is played in the game, Carlsen correctly took on d5, and this becomes very awkward. You can't take with the queen because of knight b6, and even if you exchange the queens off, this is a fork, and the rook has to move in. The bishop is lost, right? If you play with the move c takes d5, this is also a mistake because white can play knight e3, and we can see the downside of playing a5 is that this b5 square is weakened. So knight b5 is coming next, and not really a lot that black can do against it. So best here is to play the move knight takes d5, but white just plays c3 in this position and just has a really solid advantage here. Like, it's very difficult for black to develop. Knight f6 was played, bishop d3, and now bishop e6, and now white castles. And you know, if you play g6, bishop g7, it still doesn't work because white can play knight d6 check, right? And at the very least misplace the king and win a pawn. And so black saw nothing better to do than just to give up the bishop. But now look at this position. 2 bishops, big center, castle, lead in development, everything just favors white. And Carlsen correctly played the move queen g3 in this position, after which his opponent blundered with g6. But Carlsen didn't find the best move, but the best move would have been d5 here, actually. Because cd5 fails to bishop e5, king e7, and now bishop c7. If the queen moves away, then bishop d6 is, queen d6 is mate, and otherwise they're just losing the queen. If e d5, then after rook fe1, this is just basically lost. Nothing to be done there. If you play bishop g7 now, then this is considered best, but you'll simply lose 2 pawns here. And then, the rook comes in, and 2 active rooks in the center of the board. This is also hopeless. So d5 would have been very nice. Instead, better is just to play the move at d5. But after rook fe1, white is just so much better. Like, they can first off just double up on the e-file. Black can't really play the move bishop e7 because g7 falls. h4, h5 also just very nice to get more space on the king side. Strategically, this is just a 1 position. So that is this move, a5 actually after a4. But knight b6 makes a bit more sense not to weaken the position. But now we don't want to exchange, we'll play knight e5. And now we have ideas of the move a5 next. If black retreats with knight d7, then we can play bishop f4, and we've developed, gotten the move a4 for free, basically, right? And after e6 here, which makes a bit more sense, here we'll play the move bishop d3. Okay, first off, bishop f4 is also good. For example, bishop d6, bishop d3, castles, castles. That's also good. But I like the move bishop d3. And after bishop d6, we can even kick away the knight with a5, knight b to d5, and now castles. And I think that this pawn is possibly you have to take it, but this sort of position just gives white a very nice advantage on the open file here. Knight d5, cd5, and according to the computer, b3 or b4 is just very good here. And I think, yeah, no one is contesting that this is a big advantage for white, right? Once the bishop lands on b2. So, yeah, 2 bishops, very nice position. So, yeah, that's basically this idea of a4 is what I want to mention. I mean, you could play g6 here, which is in practice, I guess, the most common move. But I'm guessing queen f3 here is just a very good move. Or, okay, apparently computer says a5, which, okay, I'll put this in the notes after, but yeah, this looks very, 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 very good. g3, bishop g2, bishop f4. Yep. Very good position, nonetheless. So, yeah, that's the move knight bd7, and this overall this move c6, which is, you just use from 95 and you should have a good position. Instead, a6 is actually the most common move, and this is the choice of strong players these days, which controls the b5 square and prepares to develop with b5 and bishop e7. But black should be careful not to do it too early. First off, we will play g3 because it makes sense to develop the bishop on this diagonal, challenging the bishop. And black should not play the move b5 now, because now they've weakened the queen side somewhat, and if they want to play bishop e7, they've also weakened some of the light squares, right, as a result. So, for example, here we'll play bishop e2, bishop e7, castles, e6, and now we'll play the move knight e5, which is not very intuitive, but the point is that after we exchange the bishops, the idea of queen f3 as well as bishop f4 become really powerful because this rook in the corner is hanging, right? So after b4, let's say, which is the most popular move, we can play queen f3, c6, and now knight e4. So you cannot take on e4 here because knight queen f7 and the queen takes queen b7 here just wins the rook in the corner and the game, as well as knight f7 is a threat, right? So instead of knight c4, queen d5 has to be played, but now we'll play rook e1. And there are some forcing lines here. After knight bd7, we will harass the queen with c4. The idea beside that is that if you take on c3, which is the best move, then after b takes c3, there is a threat of knight takes c6, followed by knight takes f6 with a discovered check, right? So after this one, knight takes e5 is forced, d5. Black will exchange some pieces, but will activate the rook here. And the point that we need to understand is that any endgame here is very good for white because if we're able to dominate the d file. For example, if black plays first off rook b8, just trying to prevent the move rook b1, which is quite nice for white, we can play bishop e3. If they play, you know, let's say bishop e7, just trying to castle, then now rook d1 is very, very nice, and this is just basically winning. Yeah, because maybe rook g4 is coming next, and it's just very bad for black. Instead, c5 here makes a lot of sense, but now we'll play rook a4, and so we're offering the exchange of queens, but we're targeting this a6 pawn. Takes, let's say rook b6, and now rook a3 is a very nice move, intending rook b3. So I'll show you just a sample line here. Bishop e7, rook b3. Of course, if you take on b3 here, you just lose a pawn on a6. So rook b5, now we play c4. Now you cannot play the move b4, rook b4, because we'll exchange, and this is a pass pawn. And the black king wants to enter and kind of blockade the pawn, so we'll play rook d1 here, and this is a winning advantage because the c pawn cannot be stopped, and then later the rook can even infiltrate. Instead, after c4, they should take on b3, but now they lose the pawn on a6. They can play rook b8 and force our rook to come back to a3 here. But the thing is that we can simply move the king away to g4 or e4, advance the pawns with f4 and h4, and then later, maybe move this rook away to be more active. But the main point is that even though this rook is kind of like inactive for now, it also makes sure that this rook on b8 is putting pressure on it and can only stay on the b file if it ever wants to put pressure. So this pawn up is essentially winning here in this sort of endgame. So this is very nice if they play rook b8. If they play c5 here, which makes some sense, just to control the d4 square as well, then we can play rook b1, dominating the b file, bishop e7, now c4, kicking away the queen, queen c6, and now rook f4. So offering the exchange of queens, and after rook takes f3, the rook is quickly coming to either like d3 or a3, putting some pressure. Let's say castles. Now, I mean, castles is basically the only move, because otherwise, how else would you, get your other rook into the game? But now we can occupy the b file with rook b7, rook f8, just defending it, rook d3. And now we just want to double up. Now rook a d8 simply fails here because of rook takes e7 with the back rank stuff, right? And now king f8 here allows rook d to d7. Of course, black wants to exchange some pieces, so rook d8, rook a8, rook d to c7, avoiding the exchange. But now after black plays rook c8, we're happy to exchange here because now after rook to c8, we'll play rook a7. And this will soon win a pawn, essentially, because black cannot play rook c6 on account of rook a8 check, just winning the bishop even. So now we'll just simply activate our king, play bishop e3, and be up a pawn. And it's a very, very easy game. No risk at all. So that is this idea, actually, of playing the move c4 and then entering this sort of endgame, right? Black also notably cannot take the pawn on d4 because this loses by force. Knight f6, gf6, knight takes c6. Okay, so of course, knight c6 fails to queen c6. Oops, the rook's hanging. Gf6, knight takes c6, queen takes c4. Knight to e5 here is very nice. Discovered attack and a fork. Discovered attack and also hitting the queen, so queen d5 is forced. But after we exchange the queens, this is the open e file, so knight g6 and then wins. So very nice combination there. So yeah, that basically covers this move b5 here. So this kind of shows that the move b5 here is an inaccuracy just conceptually, because the exchange of bishops would just favor white. E6 here is not too challenging, and white just has a pretty nice advantage here because of what's just better pieces. Bishop g2, bishop e7, castles. I mean, white can play bishop f4 first or just castle first. It doesn't matter. But now bishop f4, queen d8, and now knight e5. And now makes it really difficult for black to develop with knight e6. Knight d7 is possible, but now we'll play rook e1. And the point of rook e1 is that we don't want to play queen e2 because we want our queen to be able to control this d5 square in case an exchange happens on e5, right? So that's why we play rook e1. And now black plays c6, which tries to shut in the g2 bishop, but it also completely, kills the c8 bishop. So we're very happy to see this. And now we'll play knight e4, freeing up the c pawn now. So for it to be able to advance with maybe c3 just to defend the center. And now if black ends up exchanging on e5 here and then on e4, then this position is just really, really nice for white. It's like approximately a +1 advantage, but it's very difficult for black's pieces to move and defend here because both bishops are very strong. White has ideas maybe c3, dropping the bishop back to c2, and then setting up a battery there, or even the move queen g4, trying to create some weaknesses, right? So this is a very big advantage for white and very difficult to play. So instead of e6 here, the last move and the most serious move, the main line, is move bishop g4. And here, I think that is very simple, just to play h3. If they take the knight, we'll take the queen. Maybe c6 makes some sense to, blunt this queen. But now I'll play queen d3 here with the idea of bishop f4 and then long castle next. And I think white's position is much, much better. Instead, bishop h5 makes some sense, but we'll play bishop g2, knight c6. Knight c6 preparing to long castle, but we'll play d5. And here, the complications doesn't, just favors white. Knight e5 allows g4, breaking the pin. Bishop g6, we can castle, knight e5 takes, and f4, followed by f5, and we win. So that's just one sample line, right? Of course, it can deviate, like after g4, they can take an f3, but this doesn't look so good with the bishop f4 coming, right? So, yeah, it just doesn't look good for white. Instead, they can play knight b4, trying to put pressure on the d5 pawn, but now we'll play bishop f4, queen c5, bishop e3, harassing the queen once again, and then now queen e2. So now if you take on d5, takes, long castles, white is ready with c4 next. Let's say you play queen e6, rook h to e1, knight takes e3, and now we have a very nice but very important move, queen to d3, opening up the rook, preparing to recapture with it, and now we have a very, very big advantage. The black king needs to find some sort of safety, and it's very difficult to do so. So that's just a sample line of what can happen after bishop g4 and the main line, right? So this makes some sense, try to put some pressure on this knight, but it doesn't work out for black. Instead of queen d6, we'll also look at the main line of the Scandinavian for a long time, which is queen a5. And black hopes that they can pin the knight on d4 here, the knight on c3 here. So once white plays d4, the knight's mobility is kind of limited here. But now we'll play d4. Black has the option of playing c6 or knight of6. The move order matters a bit, actually. After c6, this is the choice of John Bartholomew, oftentimes, and after knight of 3, black essentially has to go with bishop g4 or bishop f5, and we'll look at the line with bishop g4 because this is what he recommends. But this sort of position, I think, if I'm not wrong, is just like really good for white because we play bishop d2 again, long castles, and we have the flexibility of being able to move the kingside pawn up the board in case black plays knight f6 and castles, which they will more likely than not do. Of course, if they go bishop h5, we always play g4, knight e5, h4, and then here knight c4 is very nice. Queen c7 and h5, bishop e4, we can take it, go queen f3, and all of the lines here favor white. Essentially, this is very uncommon, but it could happen. If knight d6, which is the most common move, trying to exchange some pieces, bishop f4 is quite annoying. Knight comes to b6, and now we'll long castle. Just focusing on development, knight b c4, bishop takes c4, e6, and now bishop e3. Now, this is just a sample line that we want to try to push maybe c4 and d5 in the future. So something like this can be 1, bishop g3, d5 here would be quite nice for white. Okay, of course, let's look at a couple things, maybe just for the sake of completion. c5, we can take on d6, queen takes d6, and queen f5 here, just winning the piece, among other things. Otherwise, this position just opens up, right? So, that's basically this move, knight d6. They can also go knight e to f6, just retreating the knight back, but now bishop f4, queen d8, and g5, and this is too much. g6 is coming. The queen on f3 is very, very annoying to deal with, to increase the pressure. F takes g6, and now bishop g5. a very nice move. I mean, if you can also take on g6 here, but after e6, bishop g3, queen f6, we can enter this endgame. But yeah, white should still be better here because of the bishop pair and initiative here and more space in the center. Also weak e6 pawn. This is reasonable. But even stronger is the move bishop g5 according to analysis. Knight 7 to f6. We can now take on g6, h6, and long castles. Pawn to e6, knight e5, and more pieces are kept on the board. So this one gives white a bigger advantage essentially. Yeah, so that's this move. Basically the extraneous option after the move c6. Instead the main line is knight f6, and after knight f3, again black has options here, right? They can play c6, which doesn't have independent value, but you need to know the move order. So first off, let's look at bishop g4, which is the last time black can play the move bishop g4 before we do something else. Now at least we win the bishop pair with h3, right? But of course bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, knight e5. This is something you're gonna, you know, get tired of me saying. But now they should probably go for c6 here, and then we'll go for h4 and probably get a very similar position to what the main line is offering. But here e6 here just allows h4, and trying to go for h5, try to trap the bishop. But black can try to play bishop e4, just trying to pin this knight, and put some pressure. So bishop d2, breaking the pin, queen b6, and now we have the move bishop g2, putting some pressure on g7 here, on b7 here, so they can't take on d4 because we'll take, and then take on b7, winning a rook. If they play knight bd7 here, we can now play, we can just trade. King takes d7, which is forced because knight takes d7 loses to h5. So king takes d7, now queen e2. Of course, this is way too greedy. I shouldn't have to explain that. And if they take on c2 here, we can actually just castle. And there's no way that the black king is able to survive this in the center of the board. They can also play h5, but I don't think this. I think just simply long castles is very good for white. Or computer recommends knight e4. But I guess g5 or knight e4. Long castle is not very good. But this looks very good for white. The king is just way too exposed in this sort of position, right? So there are some things to know with bishop h5, but it should be just worse. In principle, black normally wants to take on f3 to try to set up the light square strategy, but this is not so good for white because, as I mentioned, and oftentimes like white can just long castle and try to go for the attack here, especially with a move like g4. Let's say long castle to e6, and now it's actually, king b1 is possible here. Getting this sort of position. And this is a very, very nice endgame actually, because even if we get this sort of position, which I know, like everyone knows that this is better for white, but it might not be to everyone's taste because this is an endgame. White has the bishop here, more space, better structure, because of the extra space, and just a very good endgame and very difficult to defend here. That's a possibility of king b1, but you can also play a3 just to prevent bishop b4. And also threaten some, discovered attacks perhaps. So queen b6. Now we can play g4, queen d4, bishop f4, something like this. Just puts incredible amounts of pressure on black. Castle here fails to g5, knight d5, and bishop d5 takes, and this bishop is loose actually. And of course, this knight is on d7 must be defended. So instead, knight c5 is better, just getting the knight out of the way. But now g5 again, knight d5, bishop d5, cd5, and now b4 even. And white has a big advantage here because black is getting kicked back. I think knight d7 even allows the move rook takes d5, or even knight takes d5. Knight takes d5 here just wins, takes, and rook e7. No, queen d5. And this is game over. There's some of these sidelines which I've just put some work on it, but it's not really necessary, to know. Essentially against bishop g4, h3, and I think that you should, I hope that you're good enough of a player to be able to figure out these complications over the board, but it shouldn't be too difficult. Now, I want to maybe mention the main line first with bishop f5, because this is very important to understanding this entire variation. Now here, the idea behind the next move, knight e5, is very important. This is basically the most challenging move against the Scandinavian. Now, the idea is that you have ideas of knight c4. The idea is that now you have ideas of knight c4, harassing the queen, as well as you have ideas of g4, right? So e6 here fails to g4, bishop g6, and now knight c4. queen has to go to a6, only square, and now h4 now. Bishop e4, so important to pin the knight to control the e4 square. But now white can play h5, bishop e4, and very important move rook h3 here. So there is now the threat of playing the move knight to d2, hitting the queen with tempo, and then playing g5 next, so that it removes the defender of the bishop on e4. So black has to take on c3 here. We now recapture with the rook, not ruining our structure. h6, which prevents the move g5, but now we play bishop f4, threatening a knight d6 check, with a discovered attack on the queen. So black has to play castle here, maybe just getting the queen out of danger, but now we play bishop takes c7 here, threatening the move knight b6, so that it's now a discovered attack, and we're also winning the rook in the corner. Now, so white plays knight d5 here, with a fork it seems, but we have to move rook a3 with tempo. Queen c6, and now bishop g3. And now white is actually a pawn up, but black can win it with b5, knight d6, and then bishop takes e2 back. But we will see after the move queen d2 and pawn to b4, let's say we bring the rook to a5, we have ideas of rook c5, and especially after, let's say, the bishop goes back to h7, we can even start the attack with g5. And this position is virtually winning for white because the attack is very strong, and despite the fact that the king is in the center, there's no way to get at the white king. So that's a good way to look at this. Okay, coming back. Instead of e6 here, knight bd7 loses on the spot to knight c4, and the queen has two squares. On b4, it's trapped immediately after a3. On a6, here we have the very strong move knight e3, and if they go queen e6, trying to pin the knight, then we can go bishop c4, and we're just hitting the queen with a lot of tempi. d5, queen e5, castles, threatening knight c4 to trap the queen actually. So bishop g6, f4, queen h5. We can take on d7, and then after king takes c7, we can play g4 followed by f5. And okay, I mean, it's a very long line, but essentially, white just wins here, and you should probably know this. Yeah, I mean, queen e6 can't be good because you can see that the queen gets hit so many times. Anyways, queen a5 also is possible, but now we play bishop d2, threatening knight b5, and there's nothing that black can do to stop it. e6, now knight c to d5, and now we win, at least in exchange. So that's knight bd7. They have to now play the move c6. So that's the point, that they need to give the square on c7 for the queen. So now knight c4 is not as effective, right? But now we'll switch to the move bishop c4, hitting f7 with tempo. And after e6, white play g4. The thematic idea. Over and over again, we see this move. Bishop g6, h4, and now knight bd7. So we cannot play h5 because there's the move knight takes e5. So now we'll have to take on d7 first, forcing knight takes d7, and now h5. The bishop has only one square to go to, which is e4, and now we will castle, and that's a very, very nice move, right? We just get castled out of danger. And at first, after bishop d5, which is the only square for the bishop, and we take with the knight, cd5 and bishop d3, it seems like white has weakened their structure so much, right? So why shouldn't black be just okay if they can get a lot of counterplay with, like, let's say g6? It's because white's advantage here is actually in this extra space, as well as maybe the move f4 coming next, as well as the bishop pair. So there are a lot of factors here that favor white, and basically this is not to be feared. For example, if black plays g6, typical move, we play h6 here, covering up the, preventing the opening of the position, and white is better here. We'll see the main line look very similar to this. But one time my opponent played h6, which doesn't really do much, and I think bishop d2, or I think even queen e2 here, bishop d2, looks just very good for white. Yeah, nothing to be done. Like, h6 doesn't do anything. And basically g6 is also not possible in this sort of position, so h6 even takes away from black's position. If they long castle here, which I've seen one time when I was analyzing Gotham Chess's games, he played this move once in Blitz, and his opponent failed to see the very strong move, bishop f4 first off, and then after g6, c4, and black is busted, basically, because rook c1 is coming. Computer recommends something like e5, and it is a bit forcing, so d5 is not the best move. You have to play the move bishop g3, then after f6, now c5. So white has ideas of even pushing the pawn to b4, sacrificing it so that it can open up the b file, or even going rook c1, very simple, and try to, attack black further, and this is just decisive. So that's the move long castling, and now we'll go for the main move, bishop d6, preventing white from playing bishop f4. But now I'll play bishop d2, hitting the queen with tempo, queen to b6, and I'll play c3. So we're very happy to take on, to play rook b1. If they take on b2, then we'll play rook b1 and we'll pick up the b7 pawn. So black plays normally the move bishop c7 here. This is quite possible, just preparing the move queen d6. And we will follow the recommendation of I am Robert Riz, who made a course on the Scandinavian like relatively recently, actually. And this prepares the move queen d6, and this has been tried in correspondence. After the move f4, it shuts down the potential battery and also gains some extra space, controlling the e5 square as well. So now black plays g6. And we will follow this high level, really like quite high level correspondence game. And this is also Robert Riz's recommendation. First off, we'll close up the king side, of course. We don't want to allow it to open up. After castles, we'll play queen e2. Now, the computer recommends this move e5, but I think that white is for choice still, because black has to figure out the complications here. Now, of course, like the correspondence says that this is equal, so it does manage to equalize, but it's a very difficult way to reach equality. Bishop e5, for example, ed4, bishop takes d7, dc3, bishop e3, queen to d6, bishop comes back to e4, rook a to e8, and there's that threat of rook takes e3 followed by bishop e6, right, with the skewer. So but also the rook is hanging actually, so takes. And here you cannot play the move king g2 for the reason that it fails to d4, right, and black is actually breaking through. So instead rook a1 is important, but now black will play bishop e6, you'll defend it with rook d3, queen e6, king f2, d4, king to g3, d3, rook c3, and this sort of position is very double-edged. And okay, like according to the computer, this is managing to equalize, but this is a very difficult way to reach equality, if anything. Yeah, even the computer says that white has some small edge, and white can hope for something here, especially if black plays inaccurately. So feel free to check the study in the link below, and you'll find the details of this game. Instead, queen takes b2 is one other possibility, and I will show a very strong line. Rook a b1, queen a3, rook takes b7. Now black retreats with queen d6. So this has also been seen in correspondence. And here we will play the move f5, and this is a very important move to try to gain the advantage here. First off, queen g3. It seems like it allows this move, but we'll play queen g2. If you take on d3, then rook takes e7, and there are some problems with the knight here. Essentially, white is better, right? And this move f5 also, something to note is that there are always these ideas of f takes e6 as well as f takes g6, as we will see in this line, actually. So black's best move is to play rook a b8. Now, I will actually explain two moves here. There is the move rook takes a7, which is a possibility. This asks a lot of questions to black, and this is one of the reasonable ways to play. And for example, black can play rook b2, bishop f4, queen to b6, and now we'll take on c7, queen takes a7, queen b2, queen takes c7, and now here we'll take on e6, forcing f takes e6. Okay, like this one does not fear, does not make us afraid because this knight is also hanging as well as the bishop. So f takes e6, we'll take on f8, knight takes f8, and from this position you can play king g2, which prevents the move queen g3, but it will allow black to win the h6 pawn, and I think this is a bit, this pawn you kind of want to keep, right? So instead we will play the move queen d2. So you're inviting queen g3 and queen g4, but after king e1, white has the pass pawn and has actually a pretty good chance to try to fight for an advantage, though the computer suggests equality after e5 though, which is why instead of the move rook takes e7 or all the way over here, I actually recommend the move rook takes b8. And according to the analysis here, after rook takes b8, bishop comes to f4, black has to play e5 here. If you play queen c6, then the problem is that after fe6, there's a threat in f7, the bishop is also loose, so bishop f4, ef7 wins, right? So you have to play e5 here, and then now white plays bishop g3, maintaining the tension. Now if black plays a move like queen e7 here, then we can play maybe king g2 and just maintain the pressure, and white should be somewhat better, at least in this sort of position. Instead, bishop g3, queen to b6, putting pressure on this diagonal. Now we will take on g6, and this is the very important resource that why we had to play f5 to begin with, is that if they play f takes g6, this loses on the spot to this very shocking bishop c4 move. Okay, I guess the question is what happens after queen c6. That's a very good question, actually. But the big point is dc4, queen c4, king h8, and queen f7 just simply wins, right? And in case you play the move queen e6, maybe which looks reasonable, then white just plays bishop d3. And I'm guessing that's also the response against queen c6. It's just bishop b3. And you're maintaining a lot of pressure on the d5 pawn, and you can even win the e5 pawn very soon. Rook e1 coming, you know, ideas like that. So essentially black has to play h takes g6, but now this h pawn can run free in some positions. And now white has the shocking move, bishop b5. You cannot take the bishop because of h7, king h7, rook f7, king g8. You'll take the queen, take the pawn, take the knight on d5, and then we'll take on e5 next. And white has basically like a really good winning chances here. For example, you cannot take the pawn on c3 because of e6, threatening check followed by e7. So now bishop f6, but now we have the very nice move bishop e5, distraction. You know, takes, check, and then e7 wins. So you have to play a move like bishop g5, but now I think rook g7 now, and just among other things, rook g7 is just very good, and king g2 as well. So yeah, this shows that this is basically unplayable for black. That to take the bishop. So they have to find the move queen e6. But after we take on e6, take on d7, queen takes d7, d5. Black can play rook e8, but now we play king g2, and we're freeing up our king, you know, from any possible checks on the long diagonal. We want to defend the pawn e5 with rook e1, and we can even try to think about infiltrating on the dark squares here with queen f3 or queen f2. And black and white is up a pawn actually. So white has a very stable advantage in this sort of position, though anything with enough clicking of the computer will lead to a draw sooner or later. That's something that I want to mention. But yeah, if black wants to play this way, they essentially have to maybe think about the move e5 in this sort of position and try to equalize this way, but it's not easy at all. And yeah, it's just practically very difficult. If black has to walk this very thin line to hold equality, they would rather just use another opening, right? And also, the last thing I want to mention is actually the move order. Is that what happens if black plays c6 first? Do we play knight e5 or do we play bishop c4? Now, it's actually important here because knight e5 doesn't do too much because knight c4 isn't a threat, right? So black here can actually play the very awkward looking but very strong move bishop e6. And the idea is that we can't play bishop c4 next. Black will play knight d7 and exchange some pieces, and they'll be fine, basically. Which is why in this position we need to play bishop c4 first. And now if they play bishop f5, knight e5, this transposes into what we know, g4 stuff. One last thing is that if they try to deviate with a move like queen c7, we can just basically say, you've done nothing with your position, you've just dropped your queen back to c7. We'll also deviate here. Queen e2, we'll play castle, rook e1, maybe play on the queen side, and at some point I think very strong is to put the knight on e5, after we get castle and play rook e1. So very nice position. Just remember that this move order with c6, you play the move bishop c4, right? Okay, so that is basically full coverage of the Scandinavian. It's I hope I provided some thematic ideas here and basically a full repertoire against the Scandinavian sidelights and all. This is a very long video, and I haven't done one of these deep dives on theory in a while, so that was difficult. But I hope you enjoyed it or it was useful to you somehow. So thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.